Welcome to episode 11 of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm Brian Russell, and it's my privilege today to have Dr. Ryan Danker from Wesley Seminary on the show. Thank you, Ryan, for being my guest.
Good to be here, Brian. Good to be here.
Yeah, and Ryan's an expert on the Wesleyan revival, and he's well-versed in theology. So we're going to try to have a good, rich conversation today about what we can learn from the Wesleyan revival for today, and also hopefully get into talking about the holiness message, which was at the heart of what Wesley was trying to do and what its implications might be for today. And Ryan, as a historian, and again, you've been on sabbatical, and you've been thinking a lot about context. As we kind of move in, it's 2020. Can you draw some parallels between maybe present social conditions? And I suppose I'm really just thinking about maybe in the United States, since that's where most of the folks that are listening to this are living, and maybe the context of Wesley's ministry in England, so that we can perhaps draw some good conclusions based on some parallels.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are lots of parallels, I think. Of course, you can't take exact parallels with history. That's one thing we have to be really careful with.
That's good.
People who want to dress up like Wesley are not necessarily going to be Wesleyans, for instance, right? So, but if you look at the context, our own context, unfortunately, is one of division. I mean, I don't think any of us can deny that. And yet there were real divisions also in the time of Wesley. And I think it's interesting to look at those divisions to see how he managed them, by the way, because he was well aware. But they had social unrest, they had division. And when you think of their divisions, I mean, they had wars. One thing to remember about Methodism is that it arose, right, roughly in the 1730s in Oxford, and 1740s in the larger scheme of things. It arose between two rebellions against the crown. I mean, that's an interesting bookend to the rise of a revival that many people were suspect of anyway. So you had the Jacobites and you had the Hanoverians, and they weren't just different political perspectives. They were actually at each other's throats about who was the rightful monarch, what dynasty should be sitting on the throne of England. Also, just a little bit before Wesley was born, you had the rise of what we might call political parties in Britain. Of course, I just read a biography of Washington by Ron Chernow, which is brilliant. I mean, it was a massive tome. It was 800 pages. It took forever. But Washington was very much against the idea of having political parties in the new republic. Mainly it's because he had seen what it did to England. Under Charles II, James II, etc., you have the rise of the Tories and the Whigs in English politics. And I mean, these people were so divided. I mean, it's almost humorous, by the way, how divided they were when it came to political perspective. They were at each other's throats. They wouldn't go to the same pubs. They had their own coffee houses in London, which was a new thing. They had their own newspapers. Does that sound familiar? They even had their own hospitals. So if you were, it always reminds me of when Reagan was shot and he looked at the doctors and said, "I hope you're all Republican," right? He was joking, but at this point, these guys aren't joking. The Tories go to St. Bart's and the Whigs go to St. Thomas's, and you don't go to somebody else's hospital because you can't trust these people. And so there was a lot of division. Now, at the same time, and I think this is something we need to keep in mind, there were also a lot of good people raising their families, loving their neighbors, caring for one another. That's not the sexy part of history, nor is it what you're going to find on, the headlines and anything. But we also have a lot of that in our culture too. So I want to highlight both. Sure, great division politically and on multiple levels, but then also, people living their lives and trying to do their best. That was the context. Yeah.
And just to drill down on just a little bit, is there a sense of, and I honestly don't know, is there like a middle class? Obviously, there's going to be some kind of entrepreneurial class already there, and that's the early modern period. But a lot of the working class, they were working in like mines and had some pretty difficult conditions in which they were laboring in those days, right? So there's a background of they're trying to raise their families, but it wasn't easy, and they had really difficult lives in some ways. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, when we look, so direct comparisons economically are impossible.
Yes, yeah.
Mainly because they spent their money differently than we did.
Yeah.
So Americans, particularly those of us in Washington D.C., spend an exorbitant amount of money on housing.
Yes.
In the 18th century, the biggest budget item would have been food. So it's a different model. But also they had a different economic strata. It was much more complex than ours. So yes, there were working poor, but there were also, there was the artisan class. There were the destitute, which was not a huge portion of the population, by the way. You had the beginnings of what we would call a middle class, mainly because of the introduction of stock markets, and other trade in the capital during the reign of William and Mary. And why do I say that? Well, because essentially with the introduction of the Bank of England, the stock exchange, stuff like this, they're moving wealth away from land ownership only, right?
Yeah.
So before this, wealth was determined by land ownership, and also politics, by the way. You could only vote if you owned land in certain, to a certain extent. And so there's a different model that's emerging. And because of this, yeah, you do see a rising middle class during the life of Wesley. It also expands as the empire takes off around the 1750s, right? Because opportunities take off. These are the people that Wesley's going to squawk at later in life because they're Methodists and they're following his frugal ways and they're becoming rich, right? And it's, it's just a different economic model. What I would push back against, by the way, is the idea that, like, you've got the famous prints by Hogarth. You remember those, Beer Alley and Gin Lane and the Sleeping Congregation and all this other stuff. A number of people have thought that those are actual snapshots of reality in 18th century Britain, when in fact it's the equivalent of a political cartoon.
Okay.
So, there were places where gin was it's kind of hard to call it gin. It was really more like moonshine, by the way.
Right.
We're not talking about some fancy drink. We're talking about bathtub alcohol. Was causing trouble, causing havoc even with people probably in the lower strata. But again, it's not just the lower class as a whole. They had a different strata. I hope that makes sense.
No, it does. I'm just trying to kind of paint some pictures because obviously there's, what I really want to talk about is what Wesley steps in a moment. I mean, God's called him. He's preaching.
Yeah.
He moves outside of kind of traditional. He's still an Anglican all the way to the end, but he step out. He does field preaching. He goes essentially to where he says, "The world is my parish." All these famous quotations that he uses, but he steps into a moment, and he probably didn't see himself as a political reformer per se. But I've heard in the past that because of the revival he started, because of the power of Methodism, that in a sense, England doesn't go the way of, say, France with the French Revolution. And I'm just curious to hear, your opinion to like, what are some, because it's at some level, when we think about our own cultural divisions now, people are like, hey, we need a revival. But what does that really mean, right? What would a revival look like that could bring some healing? And are there lessons from the Wesleyan revival that may help us to think about how to address our own political, racial, economic, all the different things that we are so good at describing that divide us, to find maybe a place where persons of faith, a lot of pastors listening to this, that we want to preach the gospel and we want to believe that the gospel is the power for salvation. But how did Wesley model that in a way that perhaps we can
Right.
capture some of that in our day. And I know that's a big question for you.
Yeah, no, it's 3 or 4, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Just solve all the problems for us, because we got to preach on Sunday, Ryan.
Hey, that's what we do here in Washington, D.C., Brian.
That's right.
All problems. Yeah, right. Okay, well, I mean, first of all, you touched on, it's called the Halevi thesis, right? That the revival stopped the French Revolution from coming to the shores of England. Interestingly enough, some people, I mean, that was rejected for decades. Although there are now some social historians who are saying maybe it wasn't just Methodism, but maybe Methodism was a part of that.
Okay.
Which I think is a better approach. I think Halevi was a bit too optimistic about the power of Methodism. Of course, you read later Methodists like Tyreman and some of these other people, they begin their biographies of Wesley. We're talking about how great Methodism is. But to get to your question, I think one of the ways to really to dig down into how Wesley can be useful to us today within the context you described is to realize, and I might be shot at by my colleagues about this, but I think it was less of a revival and more of a restoration movement.
That's good.
Wesley wanted to restore the passion, the integrity, and the theological depths of the primitive church. I mean, his nickname was Primitive Christianity, which is really a clunky nickname, but he had this driving passion because he encountered the church fathers, and he saw in them that they looked to Jesus so thoroughly that by reading the fathers, he felt like he was being pointed to Jesus. This, by the way, is why Methodists should read Wesley, because he points to Jesus, right?
That's good.
He doesn't then put him aside. So what does he do? And why do I say restoration rather than revival? I think, okay, going back to context, and we talked about this before we started recording, but I'm writing a book on Wesley's context. So we're going to talk about that, I guess. It's on the brain. But if you look at the time period, right? Look at 1660 and 1688. 1660 is the restoration of the monarchy. This is a huge thing. This is the end of the Cromwellian regime. This is the end of the Commonwealth. The Puritan Revolution is over. They bring back the monarch. They bring back the Church of England as we know it. They bring back the episcopacy, the prayer book. And what happens with that, even going through the Revolution of 1688, when they essentially tell the Catholics that they have to leave, they're trying to restore the church to a primitive vision. It's similar in some ways to what the Reformers thought they were doing earlier, right? Ad fontes, back to the sources. But in England, I think you can see this not only theologically, but you can see it politically, you can see it socially, you can see it in the architecture. Look at the buildings they're building. They look like Greek and Roman temples.
Yeah.
And Wesley is caught up in this movement of restoration because what he sees in the past, he says, this is worth taking and bringing to the present, not to copy it, but to find a way to use this in our own context, because there's truth here. And I think when we look at that, Wesley becomes not simply a radical innovator. He becomes a really thoughtful restorer of our better practices for the sake of the people and the gospel in his day. Now, he did use some what were called irregular measures, right? You got regularity and irregularity, strange words when we're talking about churchmanship, but there it is. When regular means didn't work, he would often use irregular means, like field preaching. Now, he didn't create field preaching. Field preaching was actually common in England. The problem is the last people to really use it on a grand scale were the Puritans right before they toppled the king. So that was not,
That's
I used to
interesting.
do,
So it's more like it's not a good look, and it actually signaled things that Wesley wasn't comfortable with beyond just thinking that some stuffy preacher went outside. That wasn't unusual. It was a political statement in a way. Then it's kind of like when Jesus starts preaching the kingdom. That's not just
yeah.
it's a risky kind of language. Then
Oh,
that's really interesting.
yeah, it's exactly like that.
Yeah.
And, like Jesus, Wesley kind of ignored that to an extent. Although I think I think Jesus was well aware of the political ramifications of kingdom of God language. There were different things that Wesley did. Now, what it tells me is that Wesley was passionate enough about the gospel to put his neck on the line for it.
It's good.
Even meeting in small groups, right? Technically, the Methodist meetings were illegal. Technically,
That's it. Let me just ask you a question. That's really interesting. Because I'm learning. This is really good because again, my whole point entire the podcast is I don't know anything now in my 50s, so I have to learn all this stuff now. So, and this is really good. So I never thought about this. So, like when we think small group in the United States, like it's no big deal. You call your neighbors over, or unless you have coronavirus, then you can't. But in general, it's just. But this is more about you're a potential seditious threat to the government, right? Because you're meeting illegally. Is that what you're? Is that so? Say some more about that, because that's actually really interesting. So there was real skin in the game. It's like being in a church in, say, China or something like that. You're meeting in secret almost.
That's exactly right. It's because of something called the Conventicle Act.
Wow.
Which said that if any group over 5 people meet without license for religious purposes, unless you're all related, by the way. they make allowances for larger families. Without the permission of the parish minister, or actually not even permission, probably the active engagement of the parish priest, you are holding an illegal meeting. And now, okay, let's think about that. If the rules have been applied, the average Methodist in the 18th century, and which is still, it's always been the case, the average Methodist is a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Always been that way. So when you think of it, you have women, a predominantly female movement, and they're meeting in illegal conventicles. They're potentially putting their families at risk by attending these meetings. So when we talk about skin in the game, we're really talking about if these fines had been imposed upon the Methodists, as they could have been, it would have ruined the economic stability of families where the mom might have been involved, but no one else, right? Maybe the children. And so it's a really interesting dynamic there. What they found in those meetings was obviously so enriching and so transformative that they didn't want to stay away, right? And that says something to us. Wow. What drove the early Methodists to have such a passion that they would put their entire economic stability at risk?
Yeah, answer that for us, because I think that might be this may be the key part of this whole insight. So we want to get at the heart of it. So yeah, they're illegal meetings. Wesley is willing to risk reputation, perhaps look like something other than what he was, and people are willing to actually show up. And like you said, economic stability. And it's not like people have a bunch of money in the bank. No. Skin in the game. This is that first generation folks, and they're willing to do this. So what were they finding in these Methodist societies that was so that was worth risking at all?
Yeah, well, I think what they were finding was a radically embodied community of faith. I mean, it was, so we might be getting onto some other questions, but the Methodist Society, which was then divided into classes and bands of all various sorts and sizes, what it really was it was a community, and it wasn't the church, by the way. They never saw themselves as the church. They were a renewal within the church. Mm-hmm. But they were communities of the new birth. That's how I normally talk about them when I'm teaching about this. They're communities of the new birth, and they're ordered in such a way to promote at every level Christian maturity, perfection, and wholeness. Every single ounce, every single intention behind that organization was for the wholeness and healing of the human heart. That's something, and I always challenge my students. I'm like, what would our local churches look like if we were organized in such a way that everything we did was about the healing and wholeness of the human heart. Now, on another level, these were places where people found deep fellowship, right? There was a raw authenticity about early Methodism. I think most of us would feel really uncomfortable, but most of us in Methodism are wonderfully middle class and slightly reserved and et cetera, et cetera. And yet you're going to these meetings and you're having to tell these people, was your first thought this morning, the first thought you had, was it on God? I love that question. But also, did you sin this week? And what did you do? Talk about making people uncomfortable. So there's this raw authenticity about early Methodism that probably, well, not probably, in many ways brought them together because they cared for one another. That if you look at loving, authentic relationships, it's not because you're fake with one another, it's because you actually know how messed up you really are. Right? And so there's this beauty in this freedom at so many levels that was available for the Methodists at that time. Now, let's also be aware, early Methodism, the Wesley brothers kicked people out all the time. There's this wonderful list. Like I'd have to look it up to exactly to give you the date and the place, but he kicked out like 200 people from a society, right? So imagine going to a 1,000-member church and kicking out 20% of the membership. And there were certain things, wife beating was listed there. Alcoholism was, bad things. But it's always 2 or 3 people. And then you get to the bottom and it's like 147 kicked out for general laziness. Right. I've told people that I would have been kicked out,
But I have to ask, do we know what that, do you know what that he actually meant by that? What was it, like spiritual sloth, or, what was he really getting at with that? That's kind of both hilarious and maybe terrifying.
I think it's both. I think it's both, and it's fantastic. What he was saying was they weren't taking the method of Methodism seriously. And okay, let's go back to context.
Yeah.
Not kicking them out of the church.
Right.
This is a renewal movement.
Yeah.
So the Methodists are supposed to be the front line.
They're all in.
And they were the radical people who were so in that they wanted to change the church and the culture with this optimistic vision of scriptural holiness. Yeah,
and so that's what I was going to get at. So this is quick question, do we know how many people that were kicked out get back into the societies? Is there any data on that?
I've not seen that, but it would have happened. It would have happened. I have seen preachers who were discontinued and then let back in.
Okay.
There were even preachers who got into massive fights with Wesley and were kicked out and then came back in.
Okay, that's because I'm thinking, because you were just going about talk, because it's kind of, to me, it's always interesting, like, because like most of us, and we're not doing a podcast to advocate wiping out a big chunk of your congregation or whatever, or reading people off the rolls at all. That's not the point of this, but it's interesting to imagine that something was so powerful that people would want it, and if they were then excluded for disciplinary reasons, it's not like, well, who cares? It's like they would actually want to get back in. And you start talking about the optimism. So you have this kind of seriousness about Wesley, and you also talked about and I like this, and if you go back and listen to the episode I did with Kevin Watson, episode 7 or 8, we talked we started talking about entire sanctification. So if anybody wants to go back and pick up that conversation, that would be a great one to listen to as well. But we talked a lot about the class meetings, and you're asking all of these questions that, in a sense, like you already said, we show ourselves as our worst. Yet, ironically, there's something about Wesley's message that is optimistic, right? And so talk a little bit about that, because what are people really getting if they're all in with Methodism, and what's the thing that's going to draw people beyond the deep and I think all these things presuppose that deep fellowship, but what's the goal, the telos of this?
Well, Methodism pointed to the radical notion within Christianity that's always been there. I mean, Wesley did not come up with sanctification.
Yes.
He didn't come up with Christian perfection, although he was more enamored with that term than most people because of the term perfect. But there's this radical optimism at the heart of this. It says God wants to transform you. In fact, God has promised to transform you even now, even you in this life. And that's not as radical in Catholic context. It's more radical in Protestant context.
That's good.
It's so funny. When I teach church history too at the seminary, I make them read John Wesley's Plain Account of Christian Perfection. I figure if you're attending a seminary called Wesley, you better read some Wesley, whether you're a Methodist or not. And I found that we have a consortium here, and Catholics actually take classes at the seminary. The Catholics get it first, this idea of perfection and wholeness. The ones who get it next, by the way, are the Pentecostals. Mm. It's normally my Methodist students who struggle with this the most, because the original vision isn't as strong now as it once was. But at the heart of it is this optimism, but there's also this belief about grace that is so paramount to a true Wesleyan vision. And I don't mean, of course, don't ask contemporary Methodists to define grace. It's not pretty, because we talk about it all the time, but we never define it. And I think this is something we need to start doing. Wesley gave a wonderful definition. It's very short. Grace is the power of the Holy Spirit. That, it's short, but it's actually brilliant. It's brilliant because it describes a dynamic relationship with God that is transforming.
Good.
Grace is the power of the Holy Spirit. So, which isn't just any power, right? We're talking about the God who created all things, who wants to pour into us that power to enable us to become whole. And so there's this dynamism, there's this optimism, because we believe God is capable of fulfilling his promises. Right? Look at St. Paul. Look at 1 Thessalonians. I love the last part of 1 Thessalonians. God wants to sanctify you entirely, right? And I love it how he actually lists out, like, it depends on the translation, but it lists out, if you don't get the entirely part, I'm going to describe every part of the human person, body, soul, mind, etc., etc. And then the next verse says, he is faithful and he'll do this. Wesley was radical enough to actually take that seriously, right? And to say, look, God has promised that he wants to make us whole. And that's another way of looking at sanctification or holiness is wholeness. I think in our current context, we can see brokenness even better than before.
Yes.
This might be a blessing to the church, because Wesley would say you must preach law and gospel. The law part is our brokenness. We are broken. We're broken in our relationships with each other. We're broken with our relationship with God, our relationship to creation. Death and violence and hatred are real. And yet God has promised healing that actually addresses these things. And he's shown us what this looks like in the person of Jesus Christ, right? Again, we look to Wesley because he points to Jesus, and if we want to understand holiness, look at Jesus Christ.
That's good. And if you're talking to a person today, these last few minutes were really valuable. So thank you. That was good stuff. It's good for my own soul to hear that again. I love that part of the gospel. Have you found ways when you're talking to persons that are open and interested in this deep experience of grace. So, we're not talking just about new birth, justification, or initial sanctification, but trying to walk into this moment. And, and I'm not asking you to claim entire sanctification yourself, but have you found metaphors that kind of that maybe even in our 21st century language that help people to understand what that might look like, and maybe a analogy that they can see in their own lives, so that maybe they can walk into this experience that the scriptures promise us?
Yeah, I think I could think of two. One is the idea, and this is just scriptural, but Wesley used it all the time, is the idea of God as the great physician. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Great physician of our souls. Of course, you want to use King James to say we can create the shepherd and bishop of our souls, right? But when we look at sin, I think we need to, there are individual sins, right? Lying is a sin. Racism is a sin. These actions are sins. But they come out of a sinful nature. They come out of a corruption that's taken place in the human soul, in the human heart. I often describe sin to my students as a participation in death. Mm-hmm. It's this corrosive thing. But when you look at it that way and you try to understand the idea of God as great physician, then we can see sin as disease. And I think this is not only a biblical metaphor, it's also one you find in Wesley's writings. You find it I think in the writings of Wesleyan scholars. Ken Collins uses it, Randy Maddox uses it, of healing. And I think we can understand that as a better metaphor sometimes, because we understand what happens when our bodies are stricken by illness. I mean, we're in a pandemic right now.
Yes.
We need to, not only does that remind us of our mortality, which might be a good thing, but also we can see that healing does take place. And so there's the concept of holiness as healing, and God as the great physician, and the gift of grace as the medicine of the soul, I think is a really good analogy for what takes place. Now, another one, because I want to go a little deeper and touch on some other aspects of sanctification or holiness. There's so many names for this, by the way.
Yes, yeah, it's one of the confusion, right? So, and none of the words actually are all kind of either big words or scary words. Sometimes I just say becoming the person that God, I like to say it this way: becoming the person that God dreamed for you to be. And again, does God dream? It's like but I just like to. That's become the person you were created to be, something like that.
Oh well, and that's it. That's a Wesleyan theme too. I mean, being restored so that we might actually live as God intended us to live. That's also Irenaeus, right? God became man so that man could become like God. Yeah. There's a great historical precedent for that. But I also think of virtue ethics. Wesley was not a Thomist, but he does echo Aquinas a lot. I actually just published an article with a magazine in Britain with a bunch of really high church Anglicans, and I said, well, there's some Thomistic overtures here. We'll see what they say about that. But what I mean by that is that when you look at Wesley, you can see this Aristotelian tradition. So Aristotle, the practice of the virtues makes for wholeness, right? That's Nico, I can't even pronounce it anymore.
Ethics, right?
Wow.
It's the pressure of the recording. We could both say if it wasn't.
But this virtue ethics, it runs through Christianity. It's not just St. Thomas, and it's not just Aristotle. But the idea is, if you practice the means of grace, if you participate in God's work in the world, you will be changed in the process. And I love. There's Christ Church Cathedral, Oxford. This is a great analogy. I was actually at a service there, and Jeffrey Wainwright was sitting right with me. Blessed man that he was. And Karen Westerfield Tucker was sitting on the other side of me, and we were sitting in the chancel of that cathedral. And of course, that's where John and Charles Wesley were ordained, right?
Mm.
Where they went to school. There's a long, long Wesleyan history there. But during one of the sermons, because I went to both Matins and Eucharist, there were 2 sermons. I looked on the floor because, you kind of look around. And on the floor in that chancel leading up to the altar are these, it's instilled into the ground. It is the virtues. It's the classic virtues, right? Fortitude, prudence, et cetera. And then the theological virtues, ending with, at the top right in front of the altar, faith, hope, and love. Love's in the middle, by the way. And all of a sudden I realized, oh my gosh, this is Aristotelian or Thomistic virtue ethics. It's very Wesleyan. The practice of the virtues leads you to Christ.
Good.
And I found out that those are 19th century editions. Wesley never saw those on the floor, but he did believe that. But how does this relate? It's not just if I try to be good, then I will become good. That's not it. That's heresy. That's Pelagianism. By participating with God in God's work in the world, by leaning on the means of grace, by cooperating with being responsible with what God has given us, we in fact will be transformed in the process. And so, yes, healing and wholeness, transformation through process, I think both those things need to be held together if we're going to understand the progress that Wesley intended when he talked about holiness, but also the instantaneous moment involved with that. Anyway,
that was good. And, and just listening to you talk about both of these, and even going back when you first began to talk about the deep fellowship and how people kind of knew each other at their worst.
Yeah.
Getting the picture of entire sanctification is about human messiness, and no one, because as soon as you when you say, I love this, well, both metaphors, your brokenness, then God is the physician, and then this whole piece about virtue ethics, very profound, because it connects essentially piety, our practice of the means of grace, with mission, right?
Yes.
And as soon as you're in mission, you're in messiness, because we all think it'd be easier to be a Christian if we could run off into the desert and be by ourselves. Obviously, that's not true either. But so in some level, and I think this is a good place to broaden the conversation a little bit, and we're also running down on time. But for Wesley, sanctification was never just an individual experience. It actually implied some kind of what, and some of us who are evangelicals, we often struggle with is it about evangelism or is it about justice? But for Wesley, when we talk about God's work in the world, he already had a vision for what holiness was going to be, also a social holiness. And so could you just say a few words about how important that is to keep, to not just simply see entire sanctification as an individual experience that I can have, but something that I might experience so that I can be more of a blessing to the whole world?
Yeah, well, according to Wesley, you can't experience it by yourself. I mean, that's what it means by there is no holiness, but social holiness.
That's good.
And some of my more progressive friends think that means social justice. It doesn't. It's a different thing. Social justice is its own thing. Social holiness for Wesley means that you need to be in community. We need to hold one another's hands in order to move forward toward the wholeness that is promised to us. I can't do this by myself. I need you, Brian, because you're going to ask me that question. Did I sin this week? And I'm going to ask you that question, right? But it does spill out, right? So I would reject the bifurcation of individual holiness and let's just say justice, right? Yeah. I think that bifurcation is antithetical to our Wesleyan heritage. Let's go back to the class meeting just as an example, right? It was Captain Foy who gave Wesley the idea to form the class, what became known as the class meeting. It's not a real, so I know we like to say that these things have grand launches, right? Like the Holy Club had to have had this real pious intention. It was a homework group when it first started out. And likewise with the class meetings were intended to raise money. They were intended to raise money for buildings. And what happened happened essentially that, they needed to pay for these chapels they were building for preaching. So this captain came to Wesley and he said, look, I have an idea. Let's divide up the society into small groups, and a steward can go around and collect the dues from each member, and then we'll bring in the money for the group. Well, they found out that they couldn't do that necessarily because those who didn't have the means to pay, they just didn't have the means to pay. So what he said is, the captain said, well, give me the poorest members of the society. They can give what they can, and I will pay for the rest for my class. All right, great idea. Taking care of one another, but it goes deeper than that, because what happened then is because they divided like that to raise money. In order to raise that money, the class steward had to go and visit people in their homes. And what happened is that they ended up seeing how other people lived in dire situations. They found out when somebody was sick. They found out when there was a hole in the roof that they couldn't fix and there was water pouring in on the family. And this is where the old term, the Wesleyan term comes from, watching over one another in love. So out of a transformed heart, out of the community that they had created, they ended up watching over one another. That became the dominant theme of the class meeting, not raising money or paying your dues, although, they still needed to do that. And I think it's a relational thing. You can't take the work of God that has happened in your own life and simply, close it off. And this is just an example of it. I mean, so Wesley had a love-hate relationship with monasticism, with monks, right? He in times in his journal, he'll come to a monastery that Henry VIII had dissolved, and he'll decry the dissolution of this Christian heritage, right? He did that. I was reading about the Walsingham Abbey. He thought it was horrible what that tyrant Henry VIII had done. At other times, he'll go off on these, what he called holy solitaries, and he was mocking them. He said, you can't be a holy solitary. And there was a monk that he liked to pick on, his fourth century monk, who was famous for putting himself up on a platform. You've heard of this guy. Everybody has heard about this guy. He wanted to be above everything, away from the earth, away from the world. So he lived up on a platform by himself and lowered goods up and down. Anyway, Wesley said, you can't do that. He mocked the guy incessantly because that monk, God bless him, he had his own vocation. That monk became for Wesley an embodiment of the division between justice and holiness that really can't happen in our life together. Yeah.
Yes, and we've said the word skin in the game, but here's the Methodists are taking care of each other. They're getting out there. They're with the poor. And well, so in terms of the Methodists having a skin in the game and taking care of one another, were there examples of the early Methodists that their outreach, what was involved with, say, visiting prisoners and giving to the poor? Was that only for Methodists, or was that an expanded attempt to be for the least of those in the wider society?
It was both. Okay. It was both. It was a mixture of both, depending on the circumstances and the means that they had. Wesley was sometimes a bit overly zealous about new ideas. None of us have ever done that, right?
Right.
So he tried to found a medical dispensary in London, and he quickly ran out of funds. You can't set up a free hospital. Well, I mean, you can if you have unlimited means, or if you have a massive endowment. He just didn't have that. That wasn't their primary function, and so it ended up draining them after a while. What he did find out, here's the thing, though, he didn't give up on the vision. So if you're talking about, in terms of like healthcare, the Methodists would open up medical dispensaries of some sort that was primarily for the Methodists, mainly because of that close connection they had, but that, they would not exclude others as long as they had means. What Wesley did long term, though, is he published Primitive Physic, right? Which, interestingly enough, is one of the most popular books of the 18th and 19th century, because it made what was then cutting-edge medical knowledge available to the average household. So he found a way to try to alleviate what he saw was a systemic problem. This is something we need to address about Wesleyanism and culture. Yes, individual issues need to be addressed, right? Wesley was rabid against the slave trade, especially the American version, right? But his ultimate answer was to address it systemically, right? And he went, and this is where I think we can learn from Wesley in our engagement with culture. He read more deeply than we do, I think, right? And so by doing that, how did he address the slave trade? He dug deep into the tradition. And he begins with the Imago Dei. All persons are made in the image and likeness of God. This is the bedrock of how he addresses slavery. You know, there are other ways to address slavery. It's cruel. It's dehumanizing. It's, you could go on and on about its horrors. What does he do? He starts at a more fundamental level to make other people think, oh, wait a minute. How can I, who have been made in the image and likeness of God, put somebody else just like me in chains? How can I possibly own another person who is made in the image and likeness of God? And so I think, when we look at Wesley and the early Methodist attempts to engage the culture, one, they went deep and they found a theological mandate for what they were doing. This is something that I think we as contemporary Methodists could learn from. Don't react to culture simply by, participating in cultural argument. Provide the culture with the depth of the Christian faith, the divine revelation itself, and work from there to make the culture whole. I think that's a Wesleyan approach.
Yeah, that's really good, and that's wise. And I know you have some books coming out on some of these things, so we'll have to come back when these all get published and have a deeper conversation. Yeah. But I think it's really helpful for today. And so I want to ask you now the couple questions I try to ask all of the guests on the show. Yeah. If you were going to pick, and you can go more than this, but if 2 or 3 books that have shaped you personally very deeply that you consider essential reading for Christian faith, Christian formation, what would be some of those books that have had a powerful role in your life, Ryan?
The most formative book, now that I think of it, is Jeffrey Wainwright's Doxology.
Wow. Okay. That's a good book.
I have read that book many, many times. And thankfully I can hear his voice when I read it, since he was my professor, and my friend later. So doxology, worship and life, liturgy and devotion, theology, all these things cannot be separated. There's this integrated, holistic vision of Christianity that Wainwright presents in doxology. And I think it's one of the most Wesleyan systematic theologies ever written, because Wesleyans don't normally do systematics. That's not our normal MO. Later Methodists did, but the English context, it was a different way of doing theology. Wainwright embodies that, I think, by focusing on the liturgy. The second book, Robert Louis Wilkins, The Spirit of Early Christian Thought. I can thank Jonathan Powers for that recommendation years ago. What a powerful book. Wilkin, who actually lives here in DC, is a wonderful, wonderful guy. He really gets the church fathers. The church fathers were enamored with Jesus, right? And so, and it's, the subtitle of the book is Seeking the Face of God. And that's what they were doing, and everything that they were about was seeking the face of God. And so if you want to look at the church fathers, which is what Wesley looked at, and you want to understand their passion, their drive, and their thought, I think Robert Louis Wilkin, The Spirit of Early Christian Thought. The third book, which isn't one you just sit down and read, but it is the Book of Common Prayer. you know, I'm well known for being a high churchman. The Book of Common Prayer not only shaped Wesley, and you can see it everywhere. His definition of grace, by the way, comes right out of morning prayer. It's amazing. But that the rhythms of the prayer book, the prayers, have been so formative for me, that I see now that even when I'm praying extemporaneously, I get into the rhythms of the prayer book, and there's a beauty to it. Yeah. So those three.
Well, that's a great testimony on the Book of Common Prayer too. So thanks for reminding us about that wonderful resource. And that really leads into the next question. And I guess you partially answered a little bit.
Yeah.
We like to talk about rule of life or rhythm of life or pattern or road. Again, there's different ways of speaking about that. The historical one is to talk about a rule of life. How do you order your day that allows grace to come into your life and allows you to continue to grow grow and move on towards Christian perfection?
Right. Well, I try to order my day. There are patterns. It's funny, if you're talking about patterns in my day, they begin and end with, I have a balcony here. I have a condo, and there's a balcony. This might sound funny, but my cat insists that I drink my coffee with her on the balcony every morning.
If you know cats, that's not that unusual. The cats are wonderful in their own little way there.
And you know, those around me know Paisley. And then in the evening when it cools off a little bit, she wants to go sit out there again. And so it's kind of the bookends of the day. And I always take a book with me. Oftentimes I'll take the scripture, I'll take something devotional, or I'll take historical books. You know, my rule of life, I've actually got a quote. Since you gave me this question earlier, I've got a quote that here's how I try to live it out. Although this sounds secular, bear with me. This is by Sir William Temple, not William Temple, the Archbishop, but Sir William Temple.
Okay.
He said that among so many things are by men possessed or pursued in the course of their lives, all the rest are baubles, besides old wood to burn, old wine to drink, old friends to converse with, and old books to read. I really try to order myself so that I dig deep. I think that's how I try to organize it. I found, and maybe this is why I'm a historian, I have found that digging deep into our tradition, into God's word, what a treasure, the riches that we find there are just amazing. But also, I think we should dig deep into our communities, right? Invest in people, develop real friendships, invest in your family. That's kind of how if I was to die tomorrow, I want people to say that I was an encourager and that they knew that I had invested in them.
Yeah, that's
so good. Yeah, that's kind of the way I come at it.
Well, that's almost a perfect ending for a deep dive spirituality conversation, because that's what we're about. We're about digging deep and kind of a unapologetic approach to things that truly matter in life, so that we can become all that God wants us to be for our day. And Ryan, Professor Danker, we're just grateful that you were my guest today. Thank you for being faithful to the work that God's called you to do. Thank you for this conversation. And again, just thanks for being on the show today, Ryan. It's great to have you. All right. And till next time. Oh, actually, we get, where do we find you on social media? I know you're on Twitter. We'll put you on Twitter. Are you on anywhere else other than Twitter?
I cause trouble on Twitter. Yeah. Well, actually, I want to highlight something that I'm doing with Jonathan Powers, Dr. Powers. Secondhand Religion is a new Zoom-based episode kind of thing, where we interview different church leaders about various topics, mainly related to theology and practice. And so that's great fun. It's a YouTube channel. There you go.
I'll put a link up to that in the show notes, everybody that can find that. And you've already interviewed some really interesting people. So hopefully we'll get some more listeners for that. So
we're branching out. I'm actually doing something with Anglo-Catholics, which is going to be fun. It'll be me and a bunch of probably black covered priests, because the Anglo-Catholics only wear black, right?
That's good. This is the time. I mean, my dream, and I even started this whole piece, is I think there's never been a better time to get as much really wholesome, good, powerful, gospel-centered content up in the web, because people are hungry for it. And what an opportunity we have in using these methods. You can only imagine what Wesley would be doing if you were here right now, right? So this is good stuff.
Having a heyday.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, everybody, thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Deep Dive Spiritual Conversations podcast. I'm Brian Russell. And until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be voices of hope in a world that desperately needs it. Amen. Hi, this is Brian Russell, and thank you so much for listening to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. It's a real privilege to serve you through this medium. If you would take just a minute and click subscribe, whether you're seeing this on YouTube or listening to it through Podbean, iTunes, Spotify, or wherever else you receive your podcasts, I would be grateful. And if you really like the content, please leave a review so other people can locate this podcast. If you have ideas for guests or you just have questions, you can reach out to me, deepdivespirituality@gmail.com.